Act 2 is a super interesting act to talk about. It has some of the highest highs that I've seen in any series, but also definitely does have one that I'm not going to call it a fault. It's more of a I wish we got this. So I'll make this part quick so I can spend the rest of the video gushing over everything I loved. But the act starts off with a bit of a music video, which was mentioned by the producers to essentially be a way of condensing down a chunk of the story into a montage that tells us some of what happened, gives us some cool vibes and an enjoyable intro. And they're great, they do exactly that extremely well. But I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I really do wish we actually got to properly see these parts. Obviously, it's not the producer's fault at all. They just didn't have the budget to make the season any longer. But the first one in particular for me, I was super interested in. As I mentioned in my last video, Caitlyn's development was the absolute highlight of Act 1 for me. And I spent a lot of the week following it, looking forward to seeing how far she'd go, how she'd deal with the difficult decisions being forced onto her, and weighing up catching Jinx against her feeling about enforcing martial law. And we do obviously see her doubts when she's talking to Maddie, and also the line from Mbessa about how upfront Caitlyn is, shows that these doubts have been going on for a while. So it's not like we're completely left in the dark to it all, but I still feel like it would have been an absolutely phenomenal part of the series, and I think it's one of the things that the writers wanted to spend more time on and would have done an incredible job if they did. That's the kind of thing that they really excel at, but they just couldn't due to budget restrictions. It's not particularly necessary as such for the story, so they cut it to make space for other things. And whilst I get it and don't blame them at all for it, it's a real shame to me. And I'd say a similar thing about Jinx warming to Isha and now seeing her as a kind of reason to keep going. Still worked perfectly fine without it, but it would have been brilliant to see and made her later sacrifice at the end of episode 6 even more impactful. But anyway, I've already started off this video a little more negative than I'd like, so instead I'm going to shift to talk about just how sweet this dynamic is to see, with Jinx taking care of Isha and the way that she clearly really admires Jinx, something that I don't think she's particularly used to. She mentioned to Silk about how him and Vi would always boss her around, and obviously people like Savika were straight up disapproving of her. And so it's obviously amazing for Jinx to have someone who just genuinely looks up to her so much. And it makes complete sense to me that she wouldn't want to let go of that. We saw in episode 7 that the Jinx we know was created from her trauma in season 1's episode 3, and Silco kind of pushing her into that role as well. Isha gave her a chance to leave all that behind and give her a chance to set into kind of normality as such. But we also have the subtle way that they make it clear that not everything is perfect for her. There's this kind of invisible pressure on her to return to being Jinx. And also remember how she said to Silco about how quiet it is now. Obviously Isha, being mute, doesn't dispel that discomfort for her. As Savika says, this won't last forever. And moving ahead, the sequence of Isha taking Jinx's place and showing up at the gate is super cool. But I don't think I have too much to say about it besides that, I think I've pretty much covered everything I was going to say in the previous bit. But the scene between Caitlyn and Mbessa I found super interesting. With just one line. Was it for my encouragement that your man Rictus was instigating violence in response to Mbessa's surprise at the lack of response Caitlyn had at the mention of Jinx? It immediately answers our question about how far Caitlyn had gone by showing her disapproval towards such a method. It immediately shows the dynamic between the two and their clear differences on how to handle things. And it immediately shows Caitlyn's obsession with catching Jinx fading. One of Arcane's greatest strengths is undoubtedly its efficiency in telling the story, and this scene really highlights it for me. Also, it's a cool little detail that when Vi stands up to Mbessa later on, she mentions telling someone the truth no matter what, and Mbessa points out here that Caitlyn does exactly that. that she never shies away from what she's thinking. Moving ahead to the Jinx and Savika scene, if you watched my last video, I mentioned about the Chem Baron scene showing just how impressive Silco really was for being able to somewhat unify them until they, turn on him anyway. But that just makes it even wilder that Jinx has now become the symbol that he so desperately needed. And Savika's fist slam on a table is just enough violence for the traumatized side of Jinx to flash in her mind. And we see her wrestling with whether she deserves to not be Jinx anymore, whether or not she's allowed to, or if she owes it to Silco to carry on his dream. But above all, the denial that she's in over his death, telling him to speak up now and breaking down in tears when she finally accepts, "You're really gone." It's a really great look into her head, and I think Jinx this season is about disliking what she's become. That bottomless regret of what she's done to Silco, to Vi, to everyone. I think she wants to be that hero that Isha sees, but deep down sees herself unworthy, undeserving of that. And the fact that she killed Silco is a major part of why she feels that way. But Isha doesn't know about any of that. She doesn't see that side of Jinx that she doesn't like. To Isha, she's just the hero of Zaun. She's this funny, caring woman who saved her life. She's effectively her big sister. There's a few shots of the pair which parallel her and Vi when they were younger. And of course, at the end of episode 6 in Isha's flashbacks, there's a part where Isha is drawing a blue line and Jinx is drawing a line in Vi's signature pink. But as we see at multiple points in the story, in particular this episode, Jinx seems to be convinced that everyone who sees her that way doesn't see the real her, or at the very least, they can't seriously see her that way. And I'll come back to that in a bit, but moving ahead to the rally, I love how just seeing Singed in the middle of a crowd is such a shock, and it immediately got me thinking about what he was planning, and there's this kind of sense of dread of what he's gonna do. Act 5 just loves his ticking time bombs. It really had me on the edge of my seat for a lot of it, from Ambessa knowing about the rally to Warwick charging towards Stillwater, or catching the scent of Isha's blood later, or Jace coming to destroy Victor's peaceful camp. I feel like they really nailed them, And also I love the part of Jinx rescuing the prisoners. The way she tries to play off the whole "I'm your hero" thing is a bit of a joke, not expecting them to seriously see her that way, and being initially very uncomfortable with it when they do. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this feels like the first time Jinx has ever been genuinely thanked or praised for her actions by someone other than Silco. And I mean specifically Jinx, not Powder. But I love the direction they took Jinx this season. In season 1, I felt like I didn't really like her anywhere near as much as most other people did. But something about the way they handled her this season just really landed fantastically for me. This is the good version of Jinx that she later believes doesn't exist, which I'll talk about more in the next video, but I really liked seeing the more vulnerable side of Jinx. Also, man, how sick was Warwick? They absolutely did him justice as this kind of terrifying, savage beast. Also, I love the subtle nod to his release trailer where someone's escaping in a similar looking tram thing and he jumps at them, but this time he jumps out of one at Ambessa. And I'll wrap up the part in episode 4 here because I'm basically just going to be repeating myself. But again, we see Jinx turning these emotional moments into a joke with Isha, as she's just completely unused to having people treat her that way, and ending the episode with the insanely cool fight against Warwick. And whilst I think the majority of people who have played League knew that this was going to be Vander, I still found it brilliant. So it was probably even better for people who hadn't played the game. And I think all of that is true for episode 5 as well. Definitely better if you didn't know the twist ahead of time, but still phenomenal either way. It is kind of strange that Pitfighter Vi ended up being just a montage, even though the original trailer focused on it so much. I didn't really care personally, but I can see why some people were disappointed. And again, I think it's something that the writers would have loved to spend more time on, but just couldn't fit it in. You know, it's one of those things that we didn't need, but it certainly would have been nice. Although, I love the little running gag of this guy being beaten up by Vi for like the 4th time, I think. Also, I didn't even notice that Jinx is watching her here until I accidentally paused it on that bit whilst writing this. It shouldn't really be a surprise for me, given that obviously the next scene is Jinx sneaking into her cell, and we're going to talk more about Vi and Jinx in a bit. But for now, I want to talk about Singed, dude. Some of the lines this guy comes up with this arc, you know, in my experience, no one in power is innocent, no beast is more savage than man, patience is a product of age, both of which I have in abundance. And the thing is that he's so right about it all. He doesn't care whatsoever about Caitlyn's threat to lock him in a horrifying dungeon because he knows Ambessa was going to come and see him. He knows human nature. He knows the effect power has on people, especially someone like Ambessa. I just find him to be such an interesting character, you know, bringing out and enabling the barbaric side of everyone around him. First Silka and everything awful he did with Shimmer, then Caitlyn's dungeons that she previously forbid, then Ambessa's unending desire for a stronger weapon, but above all, himself. The completely horrific things that he's all done for the sake of reviving his daughter. His means absolutely do not justify the results, especially with what I know of him from League's lore, but he's another bit of evidence in Silco's philosophy being pretty accurate. You know, when he says that real power doesn't come to those born strongest or fastest or smartest, but to those willing to do anything to achieve it. Singed is the embodiment of that, and he gets basically the best ending of anyone in the series, reviving his daughter Oriana. But I'll come back to that in the next video when I talk about Silco's speech to Jinx in episode 8. For now, returning to Vi and Jinx, it feels really weird seeing the two work together again, but obviously we still see the kind of resentment there. You know, Jinx's subtle kind of, yeah, look at me now when Vi sees the painting of her, and Vi's almost anger at seeing Jinx's happiness with Isha, as though she thinks that she's undeserving of it, as though she thinks that Jinx is putting on a bit of an act. And I do think Jinx is trying to show off a little bit for Isha. You know, we see her claiming that these mushroom things are safe to eat and then immediately regretting doing so. So she clearly didn't actually know for sure, you know. And there's also obviously this kind of awkward dynamic where you suddenly have two different people who both see you very differently meeting for the first time. And we see that old weakness complex flaring up again when Vi disagrees with Jinx's claim that she kicked Vi's butt, which just isn't really true, to be honest, but anyway. It still feels like that complex is there to me. You know, the way that she points to her breaking everyone out of the prison, how she's doing so much better than Vi. And you know, in my experience, the people bragging about how great they're doing or how happy they are usually don't believe it themselves. And at times it feels like Vi is starting to develop something similar to Jinx, except she doesn't hide it quite so much. We see Vi mentioning that she feels as though she always makes the wrong choice this season, something that we see in Jinx at times as well. And also her shock at Jinx being able to hit her. It kind of goes against one of Vi's defining traits that she tries to solve everything with her fists. That was a big part of what allowed her to protect Powder. But as Vi points out and the opening symbolizes, Jinx doesn't need to hide behind Vi anymore. And Jinx is actually the one to kind of break the ice a bit by owning up to her own mistake, reminding Vi that he's your father too. She acts a lot like Isha's older sister, and in that moment seemed to almost be one for Vi as well. I do kind of wish to spend a bit more time on a bit about Vi becoming an enforcer though. I think in general, the series didn't quite give Vi the time that she should have in a lot of her scenes. Like, it would have been cool to reflect on that decision a bit here with Jinx, because it was a pretty major one, you know, to basically be using a chemical weapon against the place she grew up in, wearing the same outfit that the people who killed her parents did. But anyway, we cut away to the Black Rose again, but whilst it was super cool and interesting at the time, this basically just ended up being, yeah, Mel was a mage, and this is why Ambessa is in Piltover. So it felt pretty unsatisfying for me. I know they probably want to continue this on in the next season with Noxus, but still, I don't really want to spend much more time on this. Especially when the remainder of the Vi Jinx issue and Vander plot this episode is so damn good. I somehow didn't realize the first time, but we see these claw marks on the door where Vander's tried to return to it, and it's just occurred to me that he had no idea if Silka was alive or not. You know, much like how Vi had no idea if Jinx was alive or not when she was in the prison in season 1. And as always in Arcane, history just keeps repeating itself. The parallels are everywhere, and Silka and Vander's dynamic seems to mirror these two everywhere they go. Except now they have the chance to improve on it, to build on it. As they read Vander's letter of peace that he seemingly planned to give to Silco, but for whatever reason just couldn't. And the pair can both see how much this could have changed things, how none of that needed to happen if they could have just both extended a hand to each other. And Vi goes to, before seeming to think that the timing just isn't right yet. You know, maybe she doesn't know how, and instead returns to what's comfortable for her, those Hextech gauntlets. But this to me feels like the turning point in the sisters' relationship. It's a beautiful scene that feels so grounded in reality, the awkwardness between the two, both knowing what they need to do, but feeling the gap between them just far too wide. But as we see again and again in Arcane, for example with Piltover and Zaun in Act 3, a greater force outside of them, one with the base violence necessary for change, is going to bring them together. It is the appearance of Vander that throws them back into their old family dynamic, starting with Vi stepping up again as the big sister protecting Jinx. And I was so desperately pleading for Vander to gain control of himself. I felt so absorbed into the desperation of everyone there. And Vi's fists, which initially split her and Jinx apart, this time she just lowers as she puts her faith in Jinx. And man, the flashback we got after, even without a word, we can tell this is Jinx's mum. You know, the hair, the look, the mannerisms are all identical to her. And it also just hit me that, as Jinx never really knew her mum, it might have been Silco that taught her to do the hair the same way. It's kind of wild that we never seem to even get a glimpse of the father though. And also that line, what's the point if we can't raise an ankle biter or two? We see that in both their actions later. Vander giving himself up for Vi and Powder, despite so much of Zaun relying on him. Silco refusing to turn over Jinx, despite being offered his lifelong dream in exchange for her. The whole scene is just beautiful, but the group hug afterwards is even more beautiful. It just makes me think of Jinx's line near the end of season 1, that I thought you could love me the way you used to, even though I'm different. It applies to all three of them here, and Isha joining in is adorable as well. You know, I do have some issues with how they handle Warwick Vander in Act 3, but in Act 2 it's absolutely peak stuff. And if that wasn't enough, we finally get the return of Jace, which at the time I assumed he returned because of Sarlo grabbing these little container things. But I guess it's just coincidence that he came back at the same time. Anyway, he looks damn good with that beard, but it's a brilliant bit of suspense to end the episode on. One thing that is kind of interesting looking back though, is it felt like at the time, we kind of had the answers to why he looks like this, why he's acting the way he is. The answer simply being, well, because of the Arcane. After whatever just happened, he decided it simply couldn't exist anymore, which is kind of right, but obviously there ends up being a lot more to it. But anyway, brilliant bit to end the episode on. I still had absolutely no idea how this was going to connect to the Warwick plot at this point, but obviously it doesn't take long to find out. Episode 6 starts with that same dome thing we see later after Jace has blown it up, but that actually didn't click at all for me until I rewatched it. You know, maybe some people out there had this in the back of their mind the whole time, but personally I didn't. But anyway, it was almost a surprise to actually see Victor here though. We'd been waiting since episode 2 to find out what was going on with him, and I certainly wasn't expecting him to be some kind of god. Also, Victor refers to the anomaly as self-replicating and self-annihilating, obviously referring to the way Victor tried multiple timelines, but in the end told Jace to effectively just destroy him. But more on that next video. Victor's camp is a really beautiful design, and it also raises an interesting question about Silco and Singed. Without their use of Shimmer and Zaun, what would it have become? Because when that dependency on it was removed, the people living in what was previously a completely run down, desolate area were able to build something very prosperous and peaceful. Obviously, that's a bit of an oversimplification. You know, Victor's powers definitely helped a lot with this, and they were all unified by it, but it's still interesting to think about. And obviously, in the next episode, we do get a vision into a world without hex tech, and presumably Shimmer too. I'm assuming it's not a thing there either. But the reason that I bring it up is because Victor says that he saw a vision in Band of what Zaun could have been and how beautiful it was. But ironically, we saw in the next episode that Zaun actually got fairly close to that in the timeline where Hextech was never invented by Victor and Jace. All this godly power wasn't able to do anywhere near as much good as these two just forgiving each other and working together. And of course a certain Yordle helping out, but more on that in the next video. And I've seen some people say that we didn't really need this flashback after the last one, especially given that Vander is basically gone by the end of this episode anyway. And I think that's a fair argument, honestly, like, I get it, but I still love that anyway. You know, if nothing else, it's crazy how Arcane pulls off so many different art styles so well. But also, it'd been a while since we'd seen Vander, besides that flashback which is more about his past with Silco rather than his bond with Vi and Jinx, and giving us that little reminder before it's all taken from us made it all the more tragic for me. It probably could have been removed, but I quite liked it personally. Now, the Caitlyn Vi scene I've spoke about in a separate video, and whilst it doesn't bother me as much now that it's had some time to settle, I still feel like this is a prime example of where the series as a whole needed an extra episode or two. Like, yes, of course, it makes sense that it's been a while and they have a common enemy as such, so of course they'd put any differences aside to deal with that. But there's never any acknowledgement, let alone discussion, about what happened between them before, and that just never really sat right with me. You know, not to mention that I'm sure Vi would have heard about Caitlyn running martial law in Zaun, and there's just no mention of any of that. Besides maybe the one comment later on that Vi makes about Ambessa oinking poison in her ear. But I really think Vi and Caitlyn's relationship in particular is one that felt very rushed at times. You know, there's so many little parts in this act where it really would have benefited from just a little bit more time. But anyway, that minor little complaint was completely offset by how cool the scene of Vi taking down Ambessa was. And the tension reaches crazy levels when we start to get all these plot lines converging in one tiny location as Jace rushes down too. The whole time I found myself just praying that everyone would leave Victor alone. But of course, in classic Jace fashion, in attempting to do the right thing, his actions always have consequences that he didn't expect. And I love the parallels between this and the end of season 1. The way they both hear a quote that pushes them to pull the trigger on both of their personally crafted weapons, the way that we see the peace all around them that's about to be brought to an end. And of course, at the end of Season 1, it was the peace Jace was about to bring that was broken by Jinx. Now the peace Jinx has found is broken by Jace, as he blasts Victor and causes chaos on the commune. And of course, Vander seems to have lost any remaining trace of who he was, as only the savage beast that is Warwick remains. There's so much I want to say about Victor's little speech, but I'll save that for a separate video because I think Victor's arc needs to be viewed from his first appearance to his last to really make sense of it. So for now, I just want to talk about Isha's sacrifice, the way that she sees the world so colourfully when she reflects on her time with Jinx, the way that she sees Jinx the way that Jinx wants to be seen, only the very best side of her, the way that, just like Powder did, she hid these 3 little gems, putting the exact same number into her weapon. It's just so beautiful, so moving, and I normally don't really like characters like this, but I think Isha was really well done. You know, I felt sad to see her go. And I know I said I was going to talk more about Victor in a separate video, but I have to talk about that ending quote. You know, that which inspires us to do our greatest good also causes us to do our greatest evil. It applies to almost every single character in the show. You know, some of which more so than others, Singed, Silco, and Ambessa being the best examples who went to such evil, unjustifiable lengths for, you know, their family. And I really tried to think about why they played that line right after Isha's sacrifice, because she's probably the purest soul in the whole series. You know, there isn't an ounce of evil or malice in her, so if it's applying to her, the only thing I could think of was that in trying to save Jinx, she effectively killed Vander. But he talks about humanity as though it's essentially doomed, you know, saying, Singed was right, it's our very essence as humanity, and claiming that that was the reason for their failures in the commune, as though in spite of such pure souls like Isha, the actions of those like Ambessa and Singed will inevitably doom the world regardless, that warmongers and personal gain will inevitably destroy any attempts at a peaceful community. And it's something I'm going to talk more about next video, but let me know what you think, because I think this is a really interesting part of the series and one that everyone will see very differently. But anyway, if you did make it here, a huge thank you, because the Act 1 review was my worst performing video ever. So if you are still here, I really do appreciate it. Hopefully see you around for the Act 3 video, but either way, have a great rest of your day.